Welcome back to You Can't Say That in Court, a podcast by Rise Women's Legal Center. I'm Vicky Law.
And I'm Stephanie Melnick. We are your hosts as we continue this conversation about survivors of violence navigating the BC family law system. We recognize that the legal system we have in BC is colonial and causes harm to families, which disproportionately impacts Indigenous people.
By speaking openly about these harms, we hope to raise awareness about the challenges survivors face as they navigate the colonial family law system. Our podcast is an attempt to collectively identify the barriers and advocate for positive changes to be made. Thank you for joining. Our podcast series will discuss difficult topics such as gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. This includes physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and financial abuse. Please be aware that this is a thread that is woven throughout all the episodes, and we hope you will take care of yourselves however you need.
Okay, welcome to season 2 of You Can't Say That in Court. Last year, we focused on understanding coercive and controlling behavior. For any of you that were listening, we discussed what it is, how it relates to family violence more broadly, and also what it looks like in survivors' lives as well as in court proceedings. So when Vicky and I were talking about a possible second season, we realized we weren't done with discussing the complexities of our family law system. One of our colleagues here at Rise came up with the name You Can't Say That in Court, and we found that it fit because there are strategies required to actually get a resolution in court. Some things can be said and other things maybe not so much. And sometimes these unspoken rules are hard to understand, and they don't often account for survivors' experiences with family violence.
And while the name refers to court, what we understand is that a lot of the separation process when a survivor leaves an abusive relationship and the family law process, a lot of the barriers and complexities actually happen outside of court. And so we want to raise awareness about that as well.
Yeah, and when we realized we wanted to keep talking about these issues, it was mostly so that more people understand the challenges in talking about family violence and all the areas where there are impacts for survivors. So, this season, we're going to focus a little more on solutions. We did talk in the first season a little bit about recommendations that have been made for improvement. Some of the recommendations were made by you and I, Vicky, but we really do want to focus on systemic change as we move forward from here.
So thanks everyone for joining. And here to kick us off is episode 1 of season 2.
Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of our second season of You Can't Say That in Court. We're very excited to be back, and we're starting this episode with a guest. We were talking about what kind of things we wanted to cover in this season, and this topic was the first one to come up for us. So, in brainstorming about all the barriers that might exist when people are leaving an abusive relationship, housing came up as a major factor, and especially given BC's housing crisis. So we wanted to get into that deeper. And we're going to probably do this in 2 episodes where we get a little bit into the family law processes, maybe not aligning with the realities of housing challenges in BC. We'll get into that in the second episode. But today we have our colleague from Rise, Haley, here to help us. We're going to talk about housing insecurity, how that relates to survivor safety. We'll get into some of the legal options, but all of the intricacies of that as well, because there is a lot. There's definitely a lot here to talk about.
Yeah, so welcome, Haley. Thanks so much for joining us. I know that you wrote this very lovely and large report that was released in November of 2025 called Should I Have Just Stayed? It's a really interesting title, and I was wondering if we could start off there. Why did you choose this title for your report?
Yeah, thanks so much, Vicky and Stephanie, for inviting me. This report focuses on family violence, family law, and housing. And it's our first or the first look that we've seen where we've had a chance to do a really in-depth research project on what survivors of violence are experiencing when they're going through a housing challenge and a family law process. And so, with funding from the Hussein Foundation, I conducted this 2-year research project and interviewed 90 or 89 people, and about half of those are survivors of violence. And what that looks like is I'm asking survivors of violence questions about how did it go for you when you separated from your ex and you're going through a family law process? What does that look like? And over again, what people shared with me is how they left their abusive relationship because they really wanted to be safer for themselves and for their children. And they are in this situation where they do not necessarily have more safety. They're in really precarious situations. And they are asking me and saying to me that they are asking themselves over and over again, should I have just stayed? Like, I don't really know if I made the right choice for me and my children. And I heard that in almost every focus group from multiple people and in almost every interview. People really struggling with this reality of not sure where they're going to go next, not sure if this was the right decision. And housing has a really big impact on that, but so does, people's financial insecurity, and so does what they're going through in family law processes.
So
Yeah.
the title, Should I Have Just Stayed? Survivors are kind of questioning, should I have just stayed in the abusive relationship instead of choosing to leave?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, this was also important for me to include in the title because it was such a profound sentiment and theme from the interviews, but also because we know that society really looks and puts the focus on victims of violence and on what they're doing and on their behavior, and an over-analysis, on whether or not, it's even really real. So oftentimes survivors are being asked, like, was it even that bad? If it's so bad, you should have just left earlier. Or if people haven't left, there's this question of, if it's, why don't you just leave? And so that's a big misconception in society, that leaving equals safety. And so we know that violence actually increases after people have left an abusive relationship. They're at the highest risk of lethality. And that risk carries on for a very long time. For some people, they'll never feel safe after they've left. For some people, maybe after a few years, they will feel safer. But um, the risk increases, and also this question of where are people supposed to go? So there's such a huge lack of safe and affordable housing in BC, and so people are then leaving their home and trying to find some place to live with themselves and their children, and all of that is putting them at a heightened risk.
Yeah, those misconceptions that you're referring to, like we addressed a bit of them in one of our episodes in season one on myths and stereotypes, and so it seems like those myths and stereotypes, misbelief is still continued through this uh, journey when someone's trying to leave and trying to find housing.
And that's what I like about the title, is it captures some of that misunderstanding about
Mm.
the process of leaving a violent situation. Because what you were saying, Haley, about society expectations and thinking, oh, if it's so bad, you should just leave. Like, that's an easy thing to do somehow. But by titling your report, Should I Have Just Stayed? I think it opens the door to all of the complexities that come after that decision's made. It's not just this simple solution of, oh, you're in a bad situation, you leave it, and then everything is totally fine. And then all of the research and everything that you present in your report really gets into, after that point, what are the challenges? Why doesn't it work? And specifically with that connection with housing insecurity and the housing crisis. I think it's, yeah, very, very appropriate title that way.
Thank you. Yeah, and so what I hope comes across, and it's definitely within the report, but just something that I wish was more common knowledge is that many times people are choosing to stay in violent relationships because for them, that's actually their safest option at that time. And
Right.
there's so
Yes.
much judgment about that decision, but people are navigating often really impossible situations with a lot of lack of good options, and so people are making that choice, and that doesn't take away from the reality that what they're experiencing, is dangerous and all of these other situations. Because, as I know has been covered in other episodes, once people get into family court, there can be, this heavy scrutiny on how long people have stayed and all of those
Hmm.
different pieces. So I just want to, say that people are often choosing to stay because that's their safest option at that time. And another thing is people choose to go back because that for them is also their safest option. So the survivors I talked to in this project, many had experienced leaving multiple times and having to return to the violent relationship. Again, that's often because of a lack of housing options and really nowhere to go. And what's so concerning is when people do have to go back into an abusive relationship, it actually heightens their risk. So, someone
Hmm.
leaving and having to return, that's a really dangerous situation. People kind of shared with me it went okay at first. We kind of reconciled, everything was kind of okay for a bit, and then it actually got worse because, he realized that I had no choices and I couldn't leave even if I wanted to.
Right.
Yeah, well, what I'm hearing through this thread is the ongoing pattern of coercive and controlling behavior that we talked a lot about in our previous season. It was like a thread through all of our episodes. And so it's obviously playing into the housing crisis. And there is some here. So can I just want to maybe spend a bit of time thinking through the intersections of housing with coercive control.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that we really talk a lot about at Rise is the need for ongoing education when it comes to family violence. And, you know, even people who are very familiar with family violence have so much to learn, because one of the things we really found in this project is that the ways abusers use violence, for example, by kind of using the housing crisis itself, really affects survivors, and it may not be something that family law lawyers, for example, are initially screening for, like were you ever threatened, your housing ever threatened, or things like that.
Mhm.
But what came out in this project is that yes, abusers are very aware that often through their own tactics of violence, they've put the survivor in a situation where she cannot afford market rent. So, what does that mean? That means that if she were to leave, she would be living in a place that was maybe precarious or temporary, and really reduces her chances of having a stable option to go to. And is she really going to leave and take the kids there? Maybe not, because she might have to return. So abusers know that they have often, through their violence, limited the options for the survivor, and they know that this threat of, like, you can leave me if you want, kind of good luck, is essentially what I heard over and over again from survivors, that or they actually threaten to kick the survivor out, making them homeless. So if you have issues with how I'm treating you, then there's the door, and threatening to kick them out in winter and all of these things. One of the survivors I talked to, her abuser actually did kick her and her children out in the middle of winter, and they
Mm.
had to sleep outside.
Mhm.
So the way the house and the housing crisis are kind of manipulated as part of the threat and as part of this, overarching way that violence is being used is a huge piece of what violence looks like right now in the housing crisis.
Right. And it sounds like what you heard during your research was this hyper awareness of not having anywhere to go. And so it's very obvious to an abusive person to use this as a form of control or as a threatening mechanism, but it's not necessarily obvious to other people who are working in maybe the legal sector or somewhere else where the support workers. It's not immediately top of mind, whereas those who are living in that situation, it's
Mhm.
super obvious. And like you said earlier, where is someone supposed to go is the first question that comes to their mind, and there aren't very many options, if any.
Yeah, and I kind of want to just also point out that obviously the housing market changes with the economy, and there is sometimes more availability and less availability depending on what's out there. Um, and for urban centers, I think most people have a lot more options. There's more options to choose from when there is more availability. But when we are looking at smaller communities in the rural and remote areas, um, when the town is 6 blocks big, like there isn't there isn't more
Yeah,
availability, right? Like
yeah.
I think Stephanie, you and I have when we traveled across BC and spoken to support workers, like that was an issue. They were like, we only have so much in our small
Hmm.
town. And so if someone needs to leave, they are looking at moving to another town 2 hours away.
Yeah.
Haley, was that
Or
something that you saw or
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just say that even in urban centers, people are really, really struggling to find
yeah.
places as well. But in rural and remote areas, sometimes there isn't a place to leave, to go to even temporarily. So I'll
Mm,
just add a piece that was very common, and that is social isolation. So abusers are often, trying to isolate the survivor from their friends and family. And have been, if you've moved and you now live in a place where you don't really know anyone and it's tiny, where are you going to run to when you have to leave? And on top of that is economic abuse is extremely common. So survivors having their access to money controlled, and so they aren't leaving with, even a bank account sometimes. So where do you run to without any money and without anyone to call? And if you're in a small
mhm.
area without a transition house, it really limits your options. So um, absolutely, that's a big factor. I will just say that across the board in every community, people, even when they had, people I was speaking to were in at least a temporarily safe situation. Oftentimes I spoke to people living in transition houses, but they were very concerned about where they were going to go to next. And people were, genuinely asking the question of, I'm not like, am I going to go back? Because I'm looking for rentals, I'm looking for places hours away, basement suites for me and my kids, and I just can't afford them. And that's accessing every available like social assistance benefit. It still wouldn't be within their budget.
yeah, we talked to quite a few transition house workers just in the course of our work, and there's a huge need for a whole spectrum of housing. They talk a lot about
Mhm.
there are some communities that have very strong transition housing for that emergency moment, and that works very well. There are lots of communities that don't even have that, which gives them, bigger challenges, further challenges. But then where do people go after that short stay at the transition house, and the number of times that transition houses need to extend the stay for someone beyond what BC Housing is maybe funding them for? They get exceptions all the time because it just highlights there isn't second stage housing. There isn't, a ladder of shelter available after leaving. You have a lot of information about this, hey?
Yeah, well, yeah, because transition houses and shelters, they are these really incredible, necessary centers that provide life-saving support. And what we know is they have wait lists, and we also
Right.
know that they are temporary. So this means that
Yeah.
everyone who wants to access one can't necessarily access one when they need it, and they can't stay there forever because they are temporary. So
Mhm.
the statistics show that in BC, only 25% of women who leave a transition house are going to find housing. And only 4% of that housing is safe, affordable, and permanent. And so what that
Oh,
means is
wow. Yeah.
75% of all women who are leaving a transition house are going on to either be temporarily sheltered or return to their abuser. And that really highlights the lack of second stage housing and other safe and affordable housing. So people are leaving, going, making this really, brave decision to flee to a transition house, and they don't necessarily have an option for when their stay comes up. And, transition house workers and support workers are doing their best navigating these impossible situations, but and trying to find people housing, and often there just are not options.
Well, and those
When we
statistics
talk
really,
about, oh,
oh,
sorry, go
sorry, I
ahead,
just,
Stephanie.
thanks, Vicky. I was just going to say the stats really underline how logical it is to go back to an abusive relationship. Just, echoing back to what you said earlier, Haley, that you really hope people come away
Hmm.
with a better understanding of why someone would stay and why they would go back and why that is the safest option. If 75% of people are not able to find any housing after that emergency intervention, then yeah, what are they going to do? Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to like explore this percentage, 75 either remain temporarily sheltered or return to their abuser. Well, like, what does temporary sheltered mean? What are
It
options for
means,
those?
yeah, it could look like staying with friends and family. So that was a big theme within our research, and it also is portrayed in other homelessness research that women are often in situations, it's called, hidden homelessness, where they're not
Mm,
necessarily on the streets with their children. That's more of like the visible homelessness, but they're staying in these kind of makeshift, temporary couch surfing type situations that are very difficult to live within, so that is one piece, or other sorts of temporary shelters. I spoke to women who were living in their cars at one point when they left. So just this
right.
not safe, not stable housing. Another piece of this research that I'll just add is that people are living in really unsafe housing arrangements, often connected to the housing crisis, and that could be that they want to end the relationship, they want to leave, but they can't afford it, so they remain cohabitating with their abuser after the
Right.
relationship
Yes.
ends, which is very dangerous. Or they do or they have sort of other kind of rental arrangements that are dangerous for them and their kids. I spoke to experts who are supporting survivors who've experienced sexual assaults and harassments from their landlords, and they feel that, they can't really do anything because then they'll be homeless. So people are navigating a whole series of really unsafe housing situations where if they could afford to just move and live in a different place that was safer, they would. But that's one of the biggest barriers.
And I think your report also talks about this idea of a nesting arrangement.
Yeah.
Does that work for survivors?
Well, that was so a nesting arrangement is, you can picture sort of the nest, which is the family home, and the kids can stay there, and then one parent will be there for a period of time, leave, and then the next parent comes. So the idea is potentially it has more stability for the children. And this puts survivors in a situation where they're potentially being monitored while they're at the family residence, through, recording devices, or their ex stalking them and knowing they're there, obviously. And it also is really difficult because then they have to pay for different living arrangements so that,
Right.
or they're in some kind of temporary, like they stay with a family member or friend in the period where they're not at the house. And it just exposes them to this additional layer of vulnerability to kind of have to be constantly navigating the same shared space that their abuser is living in as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've heard about this living arrangement, and it sounds like it works really well when the separation is quite healthy or respectful, or the two parents are on equal footing, power-wise or economically. That's when it works well and provides a lot of stability for the kids. But when there's a power imbalance, I think that's when it can become, yeah, just another tool for furthering coercive controlling behavior and bad
Mhm.
behavior. Yeah.
So it circles back to coercive controlling behavior. So we're
Mhm.
looking at the difficulties of a survivor finding another home for themselves and the children. There's also a section in your report that talks about pets, because a lot of people have pets. Pets are considered a very important part of the family. Um, how do pets come into play in this scenario?
Yeah, we know that survivors stay longer in abusive relationships because they want to find a safe housing option for them and their pets and their kids. And our report details really horrific incidents of direct violence towards pets, which we know is extremely common. You know, if abuser is often violent to kids, to their partners, and to pets. And that's correlated
Mhm.
within the research as well. It's actually referred to as the violence link. And so survivors described, having to take longer to find housing that would accept them, their kids, and their dogs, for example, because they just knew that their pets wouldn't be safe if they left them with their abuser. And so that is a big piece because lots of places don't take pets and
Right.
or like there's various parameters around that. And we know that pets are also, as you mentioned, a part of the family. And survivors talked about how their children really relied on the pet as, they love their family dog. Their dog's really important to them. The idea of being separated from the dog would be really hard for the kid. They kind of act as this
Mhm.
emotional support. And then also survivors talked about the trauma that these animals had been through and how just how long it's taken some of these pets to sort of recover from the direct violence that they experienced and also the violence that they witnessed. People, kids, and pets are often walking on eggshells in these homes, and it has a huge, long-lasting impact. And yeah, so one of the recommendations we make in the report is about expanding options for pet-friendly housing and removing no pets clauses because to design safer outcomes for survivors of violence in BC and in Canada, we have to actually be designing safer opportunities for pets because people are not going to leave their pets in unsafe situations.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And there's probably quite a big link with a lack of affordable housing and the less rental units, for example, that are on the market, then landlords can be more restrictive. They can be more, quote unquote, picky about putting in place a no pets clause because they are not having trouble filling that unit. They don't have to be flexible with their potential renters. And so that intersection with the housing crisis kind of underlines how inflexible the housing becomes if it's even available.
Yeah, that's a great point. So when there's a quote in the report of a survivor who said how hard it was to find like this tiny little basement suite for her and her daughter and her pet, and that she's competing against other people who don't have pets, who don't have kids, and
Right.
who are going to say to the landlord, you know what, I'll pay you an extra $200 a month right off the top. Like it's just so
Yeah,
competitive
it's
that people
competitive, right?
are facing kind of having to be yeah, exactly what you've said, Stephanie. Like landlords can be picky, and they can make these rules about pets that puts people who really need the housing in a more difficult situation.
Yeah, so in this episode, we really just only scratched the surface of all the
Mhm.
barriers and the challenges of the housing crisis and what survivors need to navigate and how perpetrators are using housing as a tool of abuse. Other than reading the very comprehensive report, Haley, are there other opportunities for people to learn more about this issue?
Yeah, I will say Vicky's alluded to the report is quite long. I admit, yes. It's 123 pages. I'll be
But it's very
honest.
readable. It is very readable because yeah, it just reflects so many different realities, or the reality for so many different people. So I just want to put that caveat in there. It is also
Oh,
very
thank you.
readable. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm always self-conscious of how long it takes me to say things in my writing, but I will just add for people that there's an executive summary that I worked very hard to make concise. So in case
Right.
that's easier. But yeah, and the other piece, I really came away from this project understanding from survivors that it really affects their safety when people do not understand how complicated it is for them to be navigating the housing crisis. And what they really shared with me is, they want to participate in this type of research because they really want other people to understand what they're going through. In particular, they want their lawyers to understand, they want judges to understand, and police, and all of these pieces because it would really make a big difference to their safety. And so that keeps me really hopeful. Like they're generously sharing these experiences in the hopes that it would change things for survivors in the future. So, what we've done at Rise is we're creating training for lawyers through our Rise Professional Legal Education program, and it's available on our website. And what I've done is I've taken some of the topics we've talked about today and I've made a training for lawyers on how to take this information and what we know from survivors about their experiences and how to put that into your legal practice. What are some things to think about when interviewing survivors? How should we be talking about safety and understanding the housing crisis in the context of your family law practice? So those are pieces that are available within part one of our training, and there's going to be two additional parts of on the housing report and how to put that into practice. The other part is on family law remedies, and the last part will be specifically on better understanding the connection between violence towards pets and family violence.
That's great. And thank you for sharing all your information with us today. I know we're not done. This is only part one of the housing crisis and how it intersects with survivors and family law. And in part two, or episode two of this season, we're going to spend more time talking about how the family law interacts with the housing realities and what are some of the challenges that we see there. So, thanks everyone for tuning in today, and we'll hear from you soon.
Thank you so much.
Everything that we have said today is not legal advice. If you or someone you know needs legal advice, please consult with a lawyer. We want to acknowledge that this podcast would not be possible without the generous contribution by Women and Gender Equality Canada, Femmes et Égalité des Genres Canada.